All right, hello everybody. Welcome to Fireside Paranormal Podcast. My name is Jordan Klein. I am excited for this week. We got some cool things going on. One of the biggest things going on right now is the Halloween episode that is next week. We're going to be doing it October 25th. With that, the goal really is to have 100% listener stories. Okay, so if you could write out your story and send me an email, if you want to record your story on your phone and you want to email it that way, I've had a few people do that. Send it to firesideparanormalpodcast@gmail.com. If we could get those in by like the 24th, that way I can put everything together and get it all ready for the show. But like I said, the goal is to have 100% listener stories. I want your stories told, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's spooky season in full swing, so everybody loves the stories. I want to get to my guest now. I invite y'all, come sit with me by the fires, and we're going to welcome Chris Balzano. He is a writer, a researcher, folklorist, and he's the current host of the podcast Tripping on Legends. He's been documenting the unexplained since 1994 and has been a figure in the paranormal world through his books, articles, his work as director of Massachusetts Paranormal Crossroads, and now Tripping on Legends. Balzano is the author of 2 books about regional hauntings in Massachusetts, the Bridgewater Triangle, several collections of true ghost stories, and a pair of how-to paranormal books. He has been a featured contributor in more than 3 dozen other books, often called in to offer insight into the paranormal and perspective on different cases. His most recent book is Haunted Florida Love Stories. It focuses on ghostly legends across the state that all love as part of their backstory. He's appeared on radio stations across the country and throughout the internet, as well as being called upon on television shows to comment on ghosts and urban legends. He's been on Coast to Coast AM. He's been asked as a consultant on television shows like Paranormal State, Ghost Adventures, and formerly ran the paranormal news at Ghostvillage and headed up Ghostvillage for Kids. Chris, are you with us?
I am here and excited to be here.
Come on. Chris, this is why I'm really excited for this. Chris, you have done so much stuff and been in so many different aspects. Like, how many times did I message you saying, what do you want to talk about? Like, what do you even want this show to be about, Chris?
It's interesting, when you say 94, and obviously I wrote my own bio, right? But you say 94, and I think, like, what was I doing in 94 when I started this? What is the road that I've been on, the path that I've been on through this? What are the things that I've seen? And when you start to get old like me, and I guess we're talking about almost 30 years now, you see and are involved in these cycles of the paranormal, right? And what's popular in terms of how you communicate something, but also, what you're doing within this kind of paranormal world. I have to take a step back when I hear my own bio and be like, wow, I've done a lot of stuff. I've messed up a lot, but I've also, had my hand in a lot of pies, and it's one of those things where, I'm at the point now where I'm like, I really feel comfortable with what I'm doing, and I can look back and kind of enjoy everything I have done. Where in times it was like, most of what I did was because I was pissed off with the last thing I had done.
Now, let's talk, because you're a podcaster as well. So talk about your podcast. What do you do? What do you talk about?
Oh, wow. So, well, my podcast is called Tripping on Legends, and it is a play on the word legend tripping, right? So legend tripping, which for a long time in the paranormal world was this like dirty word, right? You couldn't legend trip because it wasn't taking the subject matter seriously. It's the idea that in your town right now, and probably when you were growing up and all, there was a house, right? And everyone thought it was the haunted house of the neighborhood, and used to be challenged to go up, knock on the door 3 times, count to 30, and then run away, right?
Yeah.
Or that there was these mysterious ghost lights that would appear in a certain part of town, and people would go and they would just not overly think what it was, but they would go there and they would share their ghost stories and they would witness these lights and they would just be there for the experience, right? So legend tripping is what I do, but I also, as you can kind of tell from what I've already said, I totally embrace this idea that the majority of the paranormal, especially the folklore aspect of it, which is what I'm knee deep in now, are mistakes, right? They are trips. They are the idea that you think one thing because you hear it or you read it somewhere, and then all of a sudden you hear something that contradicts it. So tripping on legends is I'm constantly tripping on the legends that I'm looking into, right? So it's wah-wah. It's like my personal joke that only I think is funny. But basically the podcast is I find a ghostly legend here in Florida, and I like to do ones that are not necessarily a popular restaurant or a famous hotel or these kind of paranormal landmarks, but one that is really deep in the community, and they tell it, right? And they tell it online. They tell it when you go and talk to them. I do a ton of research. I try to figure out, like, what is the history behind this story? Why are people telling this legend? What does it say about them that they tell it? And then I go out and I try to experience the legend just as it's being told by the people, right? And oftentimes that involves going out to the location and talking to people, seeing their experiences, having them tell me exactly how crazy I am for doing this thing, but do you know this other story in the area? And then it's about basically essentially shutting almost everything off and trying to experience the legend. Like, is this, and it's never about, is it true or is it not? Like, that's always kind of the hook of everything afterwards was like, and then we found out it was true, or the exact opposite. And then we found out it was completely crazy.
Yeah.
And then embracing both of those things, right? So not caring whether or not it's true or not true, but then also embracing the fact that, like, what people are experiencing probably is really happening to them, but it's the backstory that they make up about it that is not necessarily accurate. And all of that is cool and has its place within the paranormal.
Now, how often are the stories actually true? Like the lore?
Well, it depends on what you mean by true. You know, like, so for example, I'm getting ready right now to do one near Jacksonville. I'm going up to an event near Jacksonville.
Okay.
And part of the legend that I'm looking into, it's this old fort called Fort Clinch, which, like most of the bases and most of the forts here in Florida, has the most boring history to it. Nothing ever happens in these forts. But there is a story about four soldiers who were seen walking up a path, and they were witnessed by someone. And then the next year, on the exact same date, 3 soldiers were seen walking up a path, and the person who had witnessed them both times shouted out, "Where's the other guy?" And the ghosts shouted back to him, "He's sick and couldn't make it this year." Right? So what a great story, right? Like, that's a totally, like, it's got humor to it. It's got enough truth to it that you're like, okay, could this have really happened? And yet I have found 5 different variations of this same story. And each variation of it is someone saying that they witnessed it, or a friend of theirs who witnessed it told it to them. Sometimes they're Confederate soldiers. Sometimes they're Union soldiers. Sometimes they're on the battlefield. Sometimes it's a volunteer who hears the story. Sometimes it's the ranger who works the park, who is sitting on the back step, who sees them. Sometimes they have no face, or no heads, which I think is crazy, because where does the voice come from? So if I go there, am I ever going to find out what's true about that? You know what I'm saying? Like, is the lore true? Like, could there have been soldiers there that people have seen? Probably yes, right? Did this exact experience happen? No, but it's the story that people tell.
So
it may have happened, and that's the important part.
When you go, like, are you interviewing folks that may have seen it? Are you trying to experience it yourself? Like, is it like an investigation, or are you kind of taking more of the journalistic approach?
So, on something like this, because it's going to be more difficult to get there when it's dark, right? Because the park closes down.
Yeah.
My initial going to it is going to be looking at the place, looking at the geography of it, and then kind of walking up to rangers and saying, hey, introducing myself, telling them what I do, and you'd be surprised what people say, right? And oftentimes it's a personal experience, but oftentimes it's, no, I've heard that story, but this is what really happened. Or, no, let me tell you about the guy that spread that story. But then there are other times where we go and we try to experience the actual haunting at the time when it happened. So a good example of that would be there's this place in Wauchula, Florida, known as Bloody Bucket Bridge, right?
Oh, that sounds nice.
And the story is, what'd you say?
I said it sounds very welcoming.
Well, of course it is, right? So any place with blood in the title. So the story is that there was a midwife. I'm going to give you kind of a shortened version of it. There was a midwife who was killing the children she was delivering. She was a freed slave. This was post-Civil War, and she became obsessed with discreetly killing people's children because she had to give her children away when she was a slave, right? And eventually people caught on to what she was doing. Well, before they did, she would take the children who had passed away, and she would go to the Peace River, this one area of the Peace River. She would bury the bodies, and then she would dump the afterbirth and things like that into the water, right? And they say she ended up doing this so often that the water began to turn red in that area. So she's eventually caught. She's kind of expelled from the community, is not allowed to do that, but she returns to this exact location every day with her husband. And she goes crazy, and she starts to say that the water is filled with blood, but the husband's looking down. It's not like that. She fills up her bucket, and then the water turns to blood, and eventually she either gets so crazy she falls into the water and dies, or she commits suicide at this location. So for years, people have been reporting that if you go to that location, you're going to hear little babies crying. You're going to hear this unexplained splashing in the water. You're going to hear this kind of insane laughing right at that location, right? So when we went to that, and the other thing is that if you go there by a full moon and you fill buckets up with water, they will turn to blood. So we went there. That was something that very specifically wanted to experience that haunting the way it is. And so we went to the site. It was actually the blood moon. It was a few years ago. Not only was it the full moon, but it was the full blood moon. We filled our buckets up, and we got absolutely nothing.
No.
Right? And so we ended up getting stopped by the cops, right? And we told them what we were doing because we're always respectful. And they told us a story that I already kind of knew, was that the reason why this was called Bloody Bucket Bridge and this was called Bloody Bucket Road was that at the foot of this road, at the end of this road, there used to be a bar called the Red Apple. And the Red Apple was so violent that after shift was over, after it was closed at night, they would mop up the floors, and there would be so much blood on the floors that when they dumped the buckets, it became informally known as the Bloody Bucket because it was such a rough place to be in. And I had known that story going into it. So when the cop told me, I'm like, oh yeah, I pretended I didn't know, and I got all of it. And so the reason why this place is called Bloody Bucket is explained, right? Mm-hmm. It's clear, it's documented. I've actually found it in a whole bunch of different places, and yet people are still reporting activity at that location. People are still having this odd thing of hearing little babies crying by this one little part of the Peace River. And so it kind of feeds into the whole legend tripping idea of people experience the paranormal and then they fall back on stories that they've already heard or stories that sound familiar to help explain it because they can't process it any other way.
Let me ask you this. I'm going to interrupt you real quick. I remember hearing there's a type of haunting, and off the top of my head, it's just not coming to me, where we almost create the energy itself. Right.
So that would be called a thought form or a tulpa. And I honestly, legitimately feel that by the time we get to a location, the idea of a thought form or a tulpa is 100% understandable, because for at least the town, the towns that these stories are in, the people know them well enough that it's become a location where people go to experience the haunting. And that much juice going into a place, and that much focus and intent on a backstory, I feel one of two things can happen. One, other things in the paranormal which know that a place is getting getting attention, travel to that location, right? The same way that all of a sudden when people become a psychic, it seems like things are attacking them, right? Everyone wants to talk to them. And then the other thing is, because there is so much talk about it, so much intent focused on it, I truly feel that you can create an actual ghost in that location.
It's that energy created.
Yeah, and in Florida, probably the best example of that intention and that obsession, if you will, putting or creating a ghost, would probably be the story of Robert the Doll.
Robert the Doll.
So Robert the Doll predates Annabelle, and he is a 3 foot, about 3 feet tall doll that was given to a little boy whose name was Robert Eugene Otto. And he immediately, when he found the doll, or when he was given the doll, gave up his own name. He said, the doll is now Robert. I am Gene or Eugene. Don't call me Robert anymore. And over the course of this kid's childhood, all these weird things started happening in the house. Like small fires were being set, things would be moved, things would be knocked over. And every time his parents would kind of get on him about it, he would say, it wasn't me, Robert did it. So that's like, if you go down to Key West, Florida, which is where Robert lives, there are buttons you can buy, there's posters, and everything always says, Robert did it. As time goes on, he's shipped off to Europe because he's a fledgling artist or a burgeoning artist. He goes to Europe to study. They put Robert in the attic of the house. That doesn't contain him. Robert is found all over the house randomly and inexplicably. People hear scurrying and footsteps across the attic floor. People looking up at the house sometimes see Robert in the window looking down at them. So this is one of those things where it was really cute when he was like, a little 6-year-old boy carrying around this doll. But as he was a teenager, it was no longer cute. It was kind of creepy, right? It gets even creepier when he comes back, because as soon as he comes back, the first thing he wants, and now he's got his new European bride by his side, the first thing he wants to do is see Robert, right? So his parents end up giving him the house. It's this beautiful bed and breakfast in Key West called the Artist's House. He takes him out of the basement, and Robert does everything with him. He's back walking the streets of Key West with Robert by his side. He demands that Robert has dinner with him. He demands that Robert is in the bedroom when they go to sleep and when they do other things that you do in the bedroom there. And the wife starts to get completely freaked out because, it's kind of creepy to have this doll while you're doing all the things that couples do, right?
Yeah, and I've seen a picture of that doll too. I don't know if I'd want that anywhere near me.
Yeah, it's not a cute doll anywhere. I mean, it's kind of got this like, blank face, these black eyes, and so, she starts to find Robert different places, all the same activity, things being crashed, and so she demands that it goes back up into the attic. And so he reluctantly puts Robert back in the attic, but all of a sudden it's appearing all throughout the house again, and people who are looking up are seeing Robert like running around the attic, and they're hearing it, and eventually he passes away, and it's said that part of the ownership of the next house was that you couldn't move Robert. And so it actually took several different owners before they took Robert down from the attic, moved into a museum where people can go see him. But the funny thing is you have to be very careful when you do, because you have to follow what's known as Robert's rules, right? So the first rule is that you have to say hello to him when you first come in. So when you go on this whole ghost tour and then you're led into the museum where he is, and he's there in a glass case, you have to say hello when you get in. You have to ask him before you take a picture of him, or else it won't come out. You have to thank him after the picture, and then you have to say goodbye to him when you leave. And if you don't do all of those things, you may leave Key West completely cursed, because it's said that if you don't follow Robert's rules, bad things will happen to you. And the best part of it is you think like, oh, that's just silly. On the walls all around where Robert is are letters from people who think this curse is really something that happened to them, right? So
Really?
they had some kind of accident or bad things happen to them after they left the museum, and they write Robert to apologize and to ask him to please remove the curse because they had a family member die, or they got into a car accident, or they lost their phones, and they know it was because they had disrespected Robert, and so that's a story of could this kid's obsession with this doll have actually put a spirit into it for all those years that it was the primary focus of his love and attention.
It's like a manifest demon.
Exactly, and it's funny because people who can say like, yeah, that's creepy and he's obsessed. They create another backstory. So they say that the doll was given to him by his nanny, and his nanny was a voodoo priestess who was having an affair with Jean's father, and Jean's father broke it off and fired her, and she was so mad that she cursed this doll to, so it's almost as if we can accept that there's a monster or a demon or a weird thing going on with the doll, and yet the fact that Gene might have created it himself by just becoming obsessed is almost unrealistic, and so we have to create a voodoo curse to go along with it as well.
Man. Now, are these stories, tying back in a little bit to the book that you wrote, Haunted Florida Love Stories? Did these legends that you're looking into kind of tie in to what piqued your interest to write this book?
It's interesting because I was 3 years into doing the show before I even thought about the book. I was I have written Haunted Florida Love Stories is my 9th book, right? So I had kind of put that aside. It was just living for the moment, living for the experience. The podcast was the thing. And then we used to joke, and it kind of caught on early as we were doing it. We would do a show, and I would start telling the lore of whatever this ghostly legend might be. And we would look at each other and almost simultaneously go like, hashtag haunted love, because we realized so much of the paranormal world when it comes to legends, right? When it comes to the backstory, focuses on love, focuses on that feeling and that intensity that we have for something that we love, right? And if you think about it, and if you were to put the two things next to each other, right, and say horror or terror and love, right, they line up. Get your heart racing. Something you are both attracted to and repelled by at the same time. Have the most intense experiences of your life during, right? Like love and terror are, and especially if you have my love life, they're really the same thing,
parallels, right?
And these love stories are out there all the time, right? They're living kind of their own life, and we understand them, even though they might be implausible, as being true. So everyone knows Romeo and Juliet, right? Like two people who are not supposed to be together, who, against all odds, find each other, and because of misadventures, because of misunderstandings, they end up committing suicide. And now for eternity, they're together, right? Romeo and Juliet are together for eternity. I'm not going to sing the line, but you understand what I'm getting at, right? Yeah. That story repeats itself over and over and over again. So even when I was in Massachusetts and we had a place like the Sonnet Ledge, which had this woman in white, well, why did she commit suicide? She was supposed to meet the man she loved. He never showed up, so she jumped from the ledge. And so that kind of story, or the two lovers who are in a love triangle, and the other guy kills one because he can't be with her. Or, the other aspects of love are the love of a parent for a child. So parents who keep coming back because for one reason or another they got separated from their children. And then, of course, the last version of that love is something that you did in life that you were so passionate about that even after you die, you keep coming back to do it over and over and over again. And the book just naturally came from that because we had collected so many stories. And the funniest part is that now, it's been essentially 2 years since I wrote the book. I can make another Haunted Florida Love Stories Part 2 because I've now collected a whole nother legion of ghost stories that all have the same theme going through them.
Now, after the book came out, did a lot of people start sending their stories in with it?
It's funny. I usually have to seek these things out, and I think it's been a pretty steady, like kind of flow of stories in. I like to think that the book is like everyone's buying the book, but I don't think I have enough. I don't think I've sold enough copies to move the needle on that. But it's been pretty consistent. What happens is I find more often than not, someone listens to the show or they buy the book and they're not in Florida and they tell me I have that exact same story, here in West Virginia or here in Ohio or here in Iowa. Like, I get much more of that, and then they want me to kind of explore that story for them and see the connections between them, which is a lot of what the show is.
Now, would you have any interest to branching that out as state to state, like the West Virginia haunted West Virginia love stories?
So the funny thing is that I could be wrong. There are over 200 books in the haunted series for History Press, right? So you have Haunted Bethesda, you have Haunted Boston, you have Haunted California. All of these, which are regional, right? Because that's what History Press does, is they make regional ghost stories.
Uh-huh.
As far as I know, of those 200, the only one that has a theme is mine. So even though it does have the geographical part to it, they all have just that. Mine actually has this twist, and they were immediately interested in it. So it's interesting that I'm the only one that actually has a theme to it. Whether I would do it state by state, here's what I discovered, and it's part of the book that I'm working on right now. I'm suffering a bit from this as well, which is I don't want to do stories that I'm not emotionally attached to.
Gotcha.
So in Haunted Florida Love Stories, every single story that's in there, save 2, I've been to, and I've experienced them, and I've at least touched the building that I talk about, or I've walked the wooded path that I reference. I wouldn't want to just collect stories in that way. I've got another thing I'm working on that does that, but I mean, I don't think I would want to do a series unless History Press wanted to pay me to, live in a certain location for like a month and just spend every day journeying out to these places. I'm just discovering there's something disingenuous about writing the kind of stuff I write without having experienced it firsthand.
Now, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on 2 things right now, both of which are equally pulling at me, but only one of which I know is going to pay me. So it's kind of and
it might
more
take precedence.
I'm under contract for, right? One is Haunted Ocala. So there is a huge national forest here in Florida called the Ocala National Forest, and it is one of the most ridiculously haunted places that I've ever experienced.
Really?
In addition to all the ghost stories that come out of here, there are stories of Bigfoot, swamp-type creatures. There are stories of occult happenings. There are, more missing people than I would ever be able to follow up on, murder cases. It's all of this kind of, this mixture of it that has not only kind of impacted the forest itself, but also seems to infect the towns around it. Wow. I did something very similar to that. The first book I wrote was about a town in the Bridgewater Triangle that also has those same kind of features to it, right? And it was this idea of, can the same energy that causes paranormal, or that at least helps to breed the paranormal, can it also impact mental health and weird crime and suicide rates and divorce rates and things like that, because this small little town in Massachusetts called Freetown was having a higher rate of all of that stuff.
Yep.
And then also having these paranormal experiences. So, that book is called Dark Woods. I almost called this one Dark Woods too, but of course, they wanted to be called Haunted Ocala. But the crazy thing about it is I started experiencing things in the surrounding towns and documenting firsthand legends or folklore about that people were telling. And then all of a sudden, I just got a plethora of people who were sending me their stories, none of which I actually had experienced myself, right? So Ocala is about 3 hours from me. I've tried to get out to as many of these locations and legend trip as many of them as I can. But I'm finding it hard to write about them in a genuine way because I haven't experienced all of them, if that makes any sense.
Let me ask you real quick, just because I'm not familiar personally. The Bridgewater Triangle, what is that?
So the Bridgewater Triangle, which is, kind of has another upswing of popularity right now. It's this area of southeastern Massachusetts, about 200 square miles, where everything you could possibly want in the paranormal happens happens in this area. It was originally coined in 1983. I should say it was coined by Lauren Coleman, the cryptozoologist, in the 70s, but he kind of formalized it in his book Haunted America or Mysterious America in 1983.
Uh-huh.
And since then, people have been reporting story after story after story of all this crazy stuff that happens in this one little area of Massachusetts. Now, the rumor is there's supposed to be, first of all, from what I hear, American Horror Story has been hinting that some of their new stuff is because of the Bridgewater Triangle. I'm not caught up on my American Horror Story. There was supposed to be a TV show that was going to be kind of like an X-Files, but it was going to be located in the Bridgewater Triangle.
Wow.
Aaron Menke, who does the podcast Lore, just had this like star-studded radio play called Bridgewater, which uses the stories as a backdrop for like this story that he tells, this dramatic paranormal story that he tells. So it's really popular right now. And it's one of those things that, it's funny, I wrote those books like 13 years ago, and people are still asking me about that stuff and still wanting to know about it because it's this rabbit hole that once you get started on Bridgewater Triangle, you can just spend months just researching and reading about all the crazy stuff. And then to actually go there and come face to face with some of it makes it even worth the while.
Now, is that kind of like would you call it like a paranormal flap, like the Mothman, where you have one incident and then you have like all of these side incidents happening at the same time?
Well, if it's a flap, it's been lasting 600 years.
Oh, okay. It's got a big wing.
It's much more. Yeah. It's much more of it was the Wampanoag, and I always say to people outside of New England, if you think Wampanoag, think of like Squanto and like the first Indians that were at the Thanksgiving, like those are the Wampanoag. That's the Wampanoag tribe, right?
Okay.
They were talking about this crazy stuff and weird stuff that was unexplained 500 years ago, right? They were, and then of course, every time you think you kind of know what the Bridgewater Triangle is and what might have started it, there's another layer to it. And you look at something like King Philip's War, which predates the Revolutionary War by 100 years, and Wampanoag and British settlers were slaughtering each other. And in ways that were uncharacteristic for their people. And it was almost as if they were possessed by the Bridgewater Triangle itself. Lizzie Borden, I always include in the Bridgewater Triangle, and most people know like the details of the Lizzie Borden case and the bed and breakfast, which is always listed as one of the most haunted buildings in the country.
Uh-huh.
So it's one of those things where, if I had to explain it, because a lot of people say, well, then why is it like this? It does seem like some kind of vortex or some kind of portal, but it's just constantly running. So it's not, sometimes new reports happen in flaps, but it's much more of like an ongoing thing where there always seems to be at least one thing kind of popping its head up, making sure the paranormal is still going on there.
and it's just not stopped.
Well, it's interesting because nonstop. When you think of it, you would think of like there's always a Bigfoot being spotted, or there's always a UFO being spotted, and to some degree that's kind of true, but it's also a general feeling that people get when they're in the triangle. Like I said, and I don't have the numbers for modern times like the last 10 years, but in that area there was more teen suicide, right? The rate of suicide at Bridgewater State, which is a mental health facility, the suicide rate at that building alone was like 7 or 8 times the national average in any other mental health facility. The divorce rate in Massachusetts is higher in that area. For a time, 24, which is one of the roads that I always call the backbone of the triangle, was the most fatal stretch of road in New England. So it's not always something that's fantastical or observable if you don't look too deep, but there always seems to be something happening there.
There's some kind of underlying, I guess, disturbance in the force.
Yeah, and part of the attacks that I got when I published that book was this idea of negative energy. Like, well, energy can't be positive or negative; it's just energy. Which is why I like folklore, because in folklore you can say things like negative energy and people go, groovy, man, totally got it. But in the paranormal world of investigators, they're like, well, that's not something that you can necessarily like hold in your hand or prove or get off a meter. But there does seem to be a negative cloud that lies over that place. And I know people, for example, in Freetown, which is one of the apexes of the triangle, people I know who work all sides of magic find that their spells and their intentions are more powerful in the forest than any other place they've been. So when things like that come out, it continues to kind of feed the reputation of the Bridgewater Triangle.
That's pretty incredible. I've never heard of it before.
But now you're going to look it up, aren't you?
I know. Everybody get your pen and paper out. The Bridgewater Triangle.
Like I said, it's one of those things where those books are more than a decade, were published more than a decade ago. And yet when my phone rings, someone wants an interview, 70% of the time they want to talk triangle because it's still such a popular subject among paranormal people.
Now, have you found anything like that in Florida? How long have you been in Florida now?
Do I have to say 13 years? 13 unproud. Yeah, the Ocala. The Ocala is the Freetown State Forest, but like 10 times larger.
Oh, wow.
And it affects the towns that surround it, much like the Bridgewater Triangle emanates throughout the towns in southeastern Massachusetts. So it's a very similar parallel, which is kind of why this book is such a monster to write, is because, every time I discover a story, it then involves, I want to put so much research into it, and essentially being an outsider because I'm not from Florida, and then an outsider because I live 3 hours away in a very different Florida. Mm-hmm. It's hard to capture the spirit and make sure that I'm presenting it accurately.
Now, how big is that forest? I know you say it's about 10 times larger.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers with me right now. You would think I would have it. That's the oddly enough, that's the chapter with all the hard facts that is the hardest one to do, and the one that I've avoided writing.
Yeah, nobody wants to write the all the numbers chapter.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I'm saying? Like, but I mean, it's massive. And what I've discovered in doing the research is that a town that might be an hour away from the forest itself still considers itself in the shadow of the forest, because they still have some very similar experiences there, or the story leads back to it. It's one of those places where physically it's huge, but its shadow kind of lies over much of central Florida. So pretty much, from Orlando, a little bit outside Orlando, to 2.5 hours, 3 hours.
Oh.
north of it.
So it's a huge span.
And
What?
it's funny because, so there is this other area called the Green Swamp, which is probably about an hour and a half after the kind of the very southern border of it. And those two places are connected through phosphorus mines, and they're
Oh,
connected through water. And when I started asking people about Ocala stories, people were giving me Green Swamp because they consider it just an extension of it. So it really takes up a huge section of the state.
what would you say, in your research so far, and I know you're still writing the book, but like what would you say would be like the most I don't want to say like the craziest story you've heard so far, but what's something that really sticks out to you when you think about your book? What's the one story that really kicks out for you?
Wow. So one of the stories that really moves me is that there are these creatures called the Stikini.
Stikini.
And the Stikini, and it's a Seminole legend. And they are witches who, it's kind of like the spell version of a Wendigo, right?
Okay.
So they are women who they were Seminole witches who were scorned, and in their scorn, they wanted to get back at the men who had done them wrong, and so they called upon this goddess called She Who Walks the Circle, and they asked for the power to get vengeance on these men, and were granted it. And once they had kind of gotten their justice, they became drunk with the power, and they continued to use the power to strike out at other men who had not necessarily done them personally something wrong, right? Almost like a vengeance demon from Buffy, right?
Okay.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And they kept doing it, and they kept doing it, and they kept not wanting to give up the power, to the point that their bodies physically transformed into these half-human, half-owl vampire monsters, right? And by day, they can be seen as beautiful women in the forest, and at night, they turn into these, human-like owls, which attack men, drag them into the forest, drink their blood, disembowel them, and dine on their insides. And it's one of those things that if you were away from it, you would laugh at it because it just seems so silly.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, so many singular events within the Ocala mimic this. Someone has their car stall on a road, on a kind of a road through the forest, and then they hear the screeching of this owl, and then then their car is attacked and almost knocked over. And when they get out, there's scrape marks that look like an owl's claw.
Oh, wow.
But then there's also this story. So in Florida, and a lot of people in Florida don't even know this history, there's this incident called the Dade Massacre, where people were essentially going from Tampa, Florida, to this place in the Ocala, and actually the town of Ocala, called Fort King, and they got ambushed by Seminoles, right? And a band of Seminoles, because of where they were attacking from, because it was a surprise attack, they were attacking this army that was really just kind of walking in a straight line to get through the swamp. The American soldiers were wearing coats, which you don't think of as a Florida thing, but they were wearing coats and couldn't get to their guns.
Mm.
Essentially, a small band of Seminoles wiped out 110 Army soldiers, right?
Wow.
And it really starts the Second Seminole War, which is a big event in Florida history, but people don't remember the Dade Massacre. Well, this is a documented thing, right?
Yeah.
Only 2 people actually survived it.
Oh, wow.
Only one was able to give his account of what had happened, because he had hid under bodies, and then him and his friend left, and they decided to split, and everyone followed the one guy, so the other guy got out. But there was another man named James Sprague who also did the same thing, and he got out, but because he was illiterate, his story was never written down, right? So we only have this one story to go by. But I mean, the bodies are there. Like, if you ask the Seminoles, they'll give you an account of the story. Like, to some degree, it's a huge victory for the Seminoles. Like, this small band of soldiers were able to wipe out 110 well-armed American soldiers, right?
Yeah.
And yet there's a group of Seminoles that still pass along that all 110 of those people were killed by the Stikini.
Ooh.
And that they were wiped out one by one while on the path. It took them a week. At nighttime, the Stikini would come in and take 7 or 8 at a time. The same guy, James Sprague, became so scared that he ran away. He essentially went AWOL from his platoon and found them in a field. Basically, a group of these Stikini dining on the body parts of the soldiers they had just kidnapped, right? And so it's this weird mix of a folk story mixed with a specific story that's told about an event that contradicts itself, right? And yet, if you talk to people, they won't say the word Stikini, but they'll give you almost the exact same details of something that they experienced 5 years ago.
Mm.
So it's one of those stories that really drives me forward to understand. But then you realize at some point you can't, right? Like, you just have to take it that these are a possible explanation for what's happening to them.
Now, in your, I guess, research for this book, are you going out to the forest and, kind of exploring in your own right to see if you can find something, or are you going more off the local lore?
I am trying to get to as many locations as possible.
Uh-huh.
And I always try to go, because some people say, I don't know, I was somewhere in the Ocala and this happened. And so obviously you can't follow up on that. But then other people will say, nope, this is the town I was in. I was on this path. If it's a hunter, they often give me GPS. But most of it, and here's the other part about writing the book, a lot of it is they just had a ghost experience, or they had an unexplained experience, which isn't folklore, right? And so the book is a weird mix of stories that are both folklore and then just personal experiences that make you shrug your shoulders as to what might have happened. But I'm trying to get out to as many as I possibly can. It's just really hard because ticks. I get ticks every single time I go there. And then the other part of it is so many of them are just one-time experiences. You can get a feeling for the atmosphere when they have that experience, but it's not like a folk story in that people always say that in this part of the woods, this specific thing happens.
Now, when you visit these places, can you, because you said the atmosphere, can you feel it kind of in the air that something's happened here?
But usually when we go a place, there's some kind of trigger, and the trigger is part of the legend, right?
Okay.
So it might be that people say that if you go to this location, you roll down your windows and you turn off your car, a certain thing will happen, right? Or you go to the bridge and you say, mini lights, come out tonight 3 times, and all of a sudden the mini lights will appear, right? So there's a very specific ritual to it. And other times it's just, they say between the hours of 3 and 4, this will happen. And so you go there and you just be silent, right? You just try to experience it, try to take everything in.
Mm-hmm.
In every legend trip where something has happened, and probably 80% of the legend trips I've been on in Florida, something has happened. It doesn't always line up to the backstory, but something has happened. There is a moment when the atmosphere changes, right? There is a moment when you realize that the paranormal has kind of opened itself up to you and is almost allowing you to observe the story for a brief moment. And that brief moment can be a minute or like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then it's over. And when it's over, you almost feel, boom, okay, that was it. That's it. I'm done. And it's funny because sometimes you'll drive 3 hours, 4 hours to go to a location, and the actual experience, which can be kind of hung up as being paranormal or supernatural, only lasts 10 minutes. And then you go, well, it's over, and it's the middle of the night, so we might as well head home. And of course you're never frustrated by that because you just experienced something that other people might never be able to put their hands on.
Mm. Now, with those experiences that you've done, is there one that sticks out to you that's your favorite?
Well, so
Those kind of
one
quick
of the
ones.
ones that, yeah, one of the ones that's most profound would probably be at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida.
Uh-huh.
And this is actually, I've debated whether or not to tell this story because DeLand is like just barely outside the Ocala, but I think it totally classifies for the new book. Although I think it's in Haunted Love too. So we on Stetson University, there is. I was originally drawn in by a classic suicide story. So it was an undergraduate, a new woman who had just started the school. She fell in love with her English professor, which as an English teacher, that's kind of I like that kind of story, right? Of a young college girl falling in love with me. So they used to meet at this place called the Hully Tower. And that's kind of where they profess their love for each other. You know, they would sometimes make out there, and eventually they're caught. And she's thrown out of the college, and he is forced to resign. And she's sent back to her dorm room to get her stuff. She collects all of her stuff. She collects a ribbon that he gave her and some love poems that he wrote for her. She slips the security guard who's kind of like, watching her. She goes up to the top of Hully Tower. She screams his name, and then she jumps from the tower to her death. And it's said that every fall, which is when they fell in love, you can go to Stetson University and you can actually hear a woman scream this name, and then you see someone jump from the tower, but she disappears before she reaches the ground. Amazing story, great legend. Colleges are like fertile ground for this kind of story.
Yeah.
Did my research, and I discovered that there was not one part of that story that was true. That not only did the date when this woman's supposed to have committed suicide, Hully Tower didn't even exist. The man who is said to have been the college professor, and there's a picture of him in a book, actually ended up being the president of the college 3 years after that picture was taken. Never happened, but Hully Tower is this absolutely beautiful place, right? And it's hurricanes have forced them to kind of reduce it. And what I found was that there's an even better love story. Hully Tower used to have the Hully Bells, and it's named after one of the founders of Stetson University and his wife.
Okay.
His wife, I always remember her. His wife's name is Eloise, and she loved these bells, and they would play before every football game, but they would also play in the morning and at specific important times, and a lot of times to bring people to mass. She loved this tower. He died before the tower was even completed. These bells were like the world to her. When she died, years away from after he died, they are both buried at the base of Hully Tower. So if you can't get into Hully Tower, but if you look inside, you can actually see the crypt where the two of them are buried, right? And it said that on mornings between 4 and 5, you can watch the Hullys walking around that area hand in hand, right? Like they found each other in death. So this is one of those haunted love stories which kind of has a happy ending, right? Or is at least as happy as you're going to get with a ghost story.
Yeah.
That these people have found each other in death and they walk hand in hand. So we went to Stetson University. We spent the entire day doing research, talking to the librarians, talking to archivists, documenting some other haunted legends that are on the campus. Then we came back at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were at that grass on in front of Hully Tower, and we witnessed what I can probably best describe as almost like a time slip, right? For about 5 minutes, we watched not the Hullys, but what seemed like students on their way to class. And these students were almost like a negative, right? There were these dark shadows that seemed to be walking in this one section of it, almost like the scene in Poltergeist where they're coming down the stairs, but without the lights. Like just those kind of figures walking across the campus, and then almost immediately after about 5 minutes, it stopped. And when it stopped, it was over, and we knew it was over. And we looked at each other and we're like, no one's ever going to believe this, because none of it came out on camera. But more importantly, no one will ever be able to understand exactly the emotion of what we just experienced. It was one of those game changers for how you think about the paranormal.
Now, for you, seeing this, was it like flesh and blood people? Was it, just almost like shadow people walking through? What did,
Yeah,
how did you
it
perceive
was
it?
almost a mixture. It was almost like a diluted shadow person, right? Like I could tell that they were in the shape of people,
Hmm.
but it was much more wispy than like a traditional what you would think of as a shadow person. It was almost like watching fog walk, but in the form of a rough, I should say, the rough form of people. And I 100% feel that, not that necessarily that happens every night at that time, but that we were supposed to experience it right there at that moment. Like it allowed us to see it. And to me, I'm not sure. A lot of people would say, well, maybe that debunks that it's the Hullies, that maybe people are just having this experience and they think it's the Hullies because obviously their graves are right there. And I'm like, if you were debating that, you totally just missed the
You're
point of the
missing it
story.
all.
Yeah, yeah.
That's apples and oranges.
Yeah. So I always talk about this. I remember in my investigator days, I was speaking at a conference, and someone was up there, and they were showing EVPs, and the group at this conference was split over what the voice was saying, and some thought it was like, like let's make a deal, and the other group thought it was like let's have a meal. And they were really, really like getting at each other as to, the phonetic breakdown of it and stuff like that. And I finally had to stop them all and say, like, can we, dude, there's a voice that's not supposed to be there on tape. Like, can we just sit back and like be in awe of that for a bit? Do we have to argue? Like, dude, that's a ghost right there. That's something we can't explain right there on the tape. Who cares what it's saying, But, there is that kind of need to understand it, and the feeling that evidence will kind of set you free when it comes to your understanding of the paranormal.
What's that phrase? You can't see the forest for the trees. I
Exactly,
think that fits
exactly.
real well right there.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Let that hang there as I work on my Ocala book, right?
um, uh, where can folks get your books? What's the best
If
way
you
to
are,
get your stuff? Because you got a lot out there.
yeah, if you're in Florida and you were Haunted Florida Love Stories, I understand you can go to a TJ Maxx and get my book. Isn't that crazy?
That's
TJ
awesome.
Maxx is selling my book. But if you're outside of Florida or you don't shop at TJ Maxx, you can get them all on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you get your books. Like I said, I have a whole bunch. Haunted Florida Love Stories is the most recent, but like I said, I've got 2 on the Bridgewater Triangle. Haunted Objects is a really popular book, which is just an exploration and a collection of all of these different ghost stories that revolve around an object or a cursed object. And it's pretty much anywhere where you get your books, you're going to be able to find it. I always suggest trying to get a pirated one online so you don't have to pay for it. They're not that good, so.
And if they want to hear your podcast, where's the best place?
Wherever they get their podcast. So if you listen to iTunes, if you listen to Google Play, if you have Stitcher or FM Pod, like wherever you get it, it's called Tripping on Legends. You can go and sign up to follow us at trippingonlegends.com or facebook.com/trippingonlegends, or friend me on Instagram at Spooky Tripping. It's really one of those things where, like, if you just go Tripping on Legends, you're going to find us in whatever platform, except for, Spotify doesn't like us because we have video. So we always joke that we're on everything but Spotify.
And here's, I was getting ready to point that out too. It's not just audio. Sometimes, Mr. Balzano likes to put himself on camera, and sometimes you have a special co-host, right?
I'm gonna she's right down the hall, so I'm going to talk quietly about this because she literally, I was on the way home. It's my daughter. It's my 12-year-old daughter, and literally we were on the way home today talking, and she said, "People don't watch you, Dad. They only want to watch me." She's literally taunting me. My daughter's taunting. Yeah, what happened is that for the first 3 years of the show, I had a co-host who was the co-founder of this idea. She was actually the one who helped spark it for me. She ended up leaving the show, and I was doing the kind of show by myself, and sometimes I would have guests on. And then I realized that, a storyteller talking to the wall is not a storyteller, it's a crazy person, right? So I started to do it on Facebook Live so that I could at least interact with the people who were online. So I generally do the show on Tuesday nights from 8:30 to usually just before 10. And then I cut it up and edit it, and I put it out as a podcast. So if you want to get in on the action, you want to share, and you kind of want to go on the journey with me as I'm telling it, you can go to facebook.com/trippingonlegends. And one of the things I like to do, and this is me being a middle school teacher, but also me realizing as a folklorist that the way we collect and the way we spread and the way we change folklore has changed dramatically. And a lot of it is in the hands of the youth. And if you don't think that TikTok is changing the needle on how we tell a ghost story, then you're probably too old. And so part of Tripping on Legends, I call Tripping on Legends with Kids. It's where I actually take my kids out to some of these locations. I teach them how to do research. I teach them how to interview people. We, as a family, try to experience what's going on. And that kind of also grew to my 12-year-old daughter being my co-host at least once a month, where not only do I get her perspective and the tween/teen perspective on things, but I run across a story to her and get hey, Dad, this is a story you shouldn't follow up on, or this is a story you should follow up on. And then usually she insults me a lot.
That's really fun. I love the whole family aspect of it. I think it's really neat.
Well, it's I learn as much from her as I do from books, and I honestly feel that a lot of times I'll think that something totally makes sense, or I think that okay, this legend is wow, this legend's really cool. And then I'll tell it to her, and she'll just have a blank expression on her face, more than your average 12-year-old has a blank expression on their face. And I know that, okay, there's something wrong with this. This is maybe not a story to follow up on because it's not catching her interest. It won't catch other people's interest.
Yeah, that's how you measure it these days. What are the youngins like?
Yeah, and but you know what? Honestly, it's folklore and urban legends for generations were spread like you're doing, by the campfire, right? But also, I always say the best things I ever learned, I learned during sleepovers and in hanging with my older cousins, right? Older cousins teach the younger cousins things they're not supposed to learn.
Right.
And we've lost a little bit of that, right? We don't hang around with our cousins as much. I remember I asked one of my daughter's friends if she wanted to come and have a sleepover, and here's a 12-year-old, she's never had a sleepover. Because society has changed and the world has changed. And so this is kind of my way to inspire and bring that kind of storytelling back as well.
That's awesome. That's and keeping on that tradition. I think that's really cool. And I think it's important.
Exactly. And hopefully inspiring others to do it. Yeah, hey, go out and do this. And it's funny because I now know that her friends, when they have sleepovers, watch my show. And I've got a certain when we were in COVID lockdown at the very beginning, so almost 2 years ago now, I wanted to keep connecting with my students. So in addition to my lessons, every night at 9:00 I would do a fireside chat, and I would tell them a ghost story. and they watch those old episodes of that version of the show, and they absolutely love it. And
That's
she's
awesome.
not even at the summer party. There are other people hanging out, and they say, "Oh yeah, we watched your dad's show because we wanted to get spooked out." So that always puts a smile on my face.
That's perfect. Chris, we are out of time for this week. Thank you so much This is a lot of fun. I really love the stories, and I love your energy with it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm glad we were able to get together.
Hey, stay on because I wanna catch with you. After everybody, like I said, the Halloween episode is next week. Okay, so it will be on the 25th. Today we are recording on the 18th. So if you could by this weekend, please, like I said, I would love to have your stories. I would love to hear what's going on with you. I know everybody has a story. Um, Write it down, send me an email, record yourself saying it. Um, Man, if you want to pick up a time where we can record it live, I will figure it out. I know everybody likes their voice sometimes when it's recorded, right? But I think it'd be a lot of fun to get everybody's personal stories out there, for this Halloween episode. The email address is firesideparanormalpodcast@gmail.com. Send me your stories. It'll be a lot of fun. And check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/Fireside Paranormal Podcast. That's our page. Our group is Fireside Paranormal Hub. It's active. People like to have a lot of fun on there. We would love you to, join us. And Chris, you on there yet?
Oh yeah,
Come on.
I'm on there.
We have a great time on there, and I think here lately it's just turned into a bunch of funny paranormal memes, but whatever.
That's what pushes it forward too, right?
Hey,
Like that's
it's a blast. You wouldn't believe how many messages I get a day about it.
People who take themselves too seriously in the paranormal scare me more than ghosts.
Truth. Oh man, I got stories I could tell you on that one. But
sure.
until next week, everybody, don't be afraid, only believe.